For millions of years, the Aeldari Empire dominated the Milky Way. By the 30th millennium, their civilization had eliminated scarcity, disease, and manual labor. Left with infinite time and highly sensitive nervous systems, the population turned inward. Trillions of citizens fell into obsessive pleasure cults, pushing their pursuit of physical and emotional extremes to lethal levels, unaware that their collective excess was poisoning the galaxy. The only people to notice the danger were the Seers. These were Aeldari with acute psychic abilities, allowing them to perceive the immaterium, the parallel dimension of psychic energy known as the warp. What the Seers saw was a terminal pressure building in the warp, generated directly by the rampant hedonism of their own society. Knowing this pressure would eventually trigger a psychic implosion, the Seers coordinated across the Empire to sound the alarm. They pleaded with the populations of the core worlds to abandon the pleasure cults and restrain their impulses before the entire species was wiped out. The core worlds ignored them. The population was too addicted to their indulgences to stop, and publicly dismissed the Seers as puritanical zealots and paranoid alarmists. As the Empire remained in denial, the surviving pragmatists realized they were out of time. They broke off from the core society, independently engineering their own localized, desperate evacuation plans. The first faction to flee became known as the Exodites. They loaded into whatever spacecraft they could find and traveled to the extreme eastern fringes of the galaxy, settling on harsh, untamed planets they called maiden worlds. Once they landed, they made a radical choice. They abandoned the automated, labor-saving technologies of their ancestors, choosing instead to cultivate crops by hand and rely on animal transport. They enforced this technological regression for a specific psychological reason. Grueling physical labor demands constant focus. By spending every waking hour fighting to survive, the Exodites kept their highly sensitive minds disciplined and exhausted, preventing the obsessive, idle thoughts that were currently rotting their homeworlds. This illustrates how Exodites protect their souls after death without Empire technology. They construct a world spirit, a planetary grid of psychoactive crystals connecting to surface-level standing stones. Upon death, their soul merges into this vast network, safe from the warp's violent currents. By engineering an environment of constant physical hardship, the Exodites vaccinated themselves against the fatal luxury that doomed the rest of their species. Not every pragmatist wanted to live in the dirt. Another group of refugees refused to abandon their technology, opting for a massive industrial evacuation. They commandeered gigantic commercial trading vessels and rapidly retrofitted them into continent-sized, self-sufficient generation arks. They called them Craftworlds. Looking at this cross-section, these ships are grown. Artisans use psychic abilities to sing a psychoplastic called Wraithbone into the vessel's skeleton. This functions as a neural grid, wirelessly transmitting psychic energy throughout the ship to power life support, artificial gravity, and propulsion. As the pressure in the warp reached critical levels, the loading process became frantic. The arks were packed with citizens, native plants and animals, and pieces of cultural history. The Craftworlds were designed with enclosed biomes and sustainable agriculture. They were never meant to land. They were engineered as permanent sanctuary worlds for an eternal exile. Escaping the blast radius of the core worlds solved the physical problem, but it left a massive psychological one. Trapped in the deep isolation of space, the Craftworlders still possessed the same hypersensitive biology that led their ancestors to ruin. To prevent their society from collapsing into a hedonistic spiral, they instituted a strict system of behavioral modification known as the Asuriani path. This diagram represents how the path functions. To prevent emotional extremes, a Craftworld citizen will lock their mind into mastering a single discipline, like artistry, leadership, or warfare. They practice this exclusively for decades, building rigid mental boundaries to suppress their darker impulses. The Craftworlders rely on a suffocating cultural straitjacket, while the Exodites rely on exhausting physical labor. Both factions engineered opposite systems to achieve the exact same result, surviving the fatal flaws of their own biology. The timeline finally ran out in the 30th millennium. The psychic pressure from the core worlds hit critical mass, and the collective depravity of the Aeldari birthed a new chaos god into the warp, an entity known as Slaanesh. Back in real space, the final boarding hours devolved into terror. Massive Wraithbone airlock doors slammed shut, and the Craftworlds violently severed their docking moorings to pull away from the collapsing planets. To ensure the arks could clear the blast radius in time, fleet commanders executed a horrific logistical calculation. They initiated the launch sequences early, intentionally leaving millions of their own people on the docks. Slaanesh's psychic birth scream hit real space, vaporizing the remaining population instantly. The shockwave tore a 20,000 light-year hole into space, a permanent weeping wound in reality that the Imperium now calls the Eye of Terror. The undisputed rulers of the galaxy were reduced to a handful of survivors hiding in the dark. Today, the Aeldari remain a fractured, nomadic species, condemned to sail the void forever, outrunning the sins of their past.